Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientists monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host for today's webinar. Today, Dr. Carolyn Rodriguez will present toward rapid-acting treatments for OCD. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation is committed to alleviating the suffering caused by mental illness by awarding grants that will lead to advances and breakthroughs in scientific research. The Foundation is the largest private funder of mental health research grants. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $365 million to fund more than 5,000 grants to more than 4,000 scientists around the world. 100% of all donor contributions for research are invested in our grants to scientists who are working to find breakthroughs in disorders such as addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, OCD, PTSD, and schizophrenia. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Carolyn Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez is Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University School of Medicine. She is also the recipient of a 2009 and 2014 Foundation Young Investigator Grant. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. Rodriguez's presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. Following the presentation, I'll present your questions and we'll answer as many of them as possible. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Carolyn Rodriguez. Carolyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. And before I start, I just want to say how grateful I am to you and NARSAD BBRF for all the work that you do, and also specifically for the webinar series. I remember being a trainee when I first saw a webinar that Dr. Carlos Zarate had presented on some of his key work in ketamine, which was quite inspirational to me. So it's a wonderful thing to be speaking to the group and coming back full circle. So first, I'd like to start by presenting funding and disclosures. The use of rapastinel, formerly Glic-13, was supplied by NORAX at no cost, and the funding for the project was made possible by a 2014 NARSAD Ellen Shapiro and Gerald Axelbaum Young Investigator Award, which made possible scientific inquiry without bias. Additional funders are listed here, including New York Presbyterian Youth Anxiety Center and NIH funding both to myself and Dr. Blair Simpson, who is also a recipient of a Young Investigator and an Independent Investigator Award, so we thank you for your support. These are some additional funding and disclosures and consultant work that I do. None of these impact on the science that I'll be presenting to you today. So let's jump into Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, also called OCD. As you all know, it's common. It's characterized by recurring, intrusive, unwanted thoughts. These are called obsessions that increase anxiety, accompanied by overwhelming urges to repeat behaviors or mental acts called compulsions that decrease anxiety. And people with OCD tend to suffer in private. We see them struggling daily with obsessions, missing work, risking relationships. OCD typically develops in mid to late adolescence with a median age of onset of 19, with a quarter of cases starting by age 14. And OCD is quite disabling and distressing. 1 in 7 OCD adults will attempt suicide in their lifetime. In fact, the World Health Organization lists OCD as one of the top 20 worldwide causes of illness-related disability. Individuals with OCD can have a range of content and fears. In terms of obsessions, these may include fears of contamination, symmetry, harm, and taboo thoughts. On the compulsion side, individuals may have behaviors including checking, washing, reviewing, repeating, ordering, and arranging. Today's standard treatment for OCD is serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SRIs. They typically take 2 to 3 months for clinical benefit, and even then, they're often only partially effective. And I feel strongly that we need more rapid-acting and robust pharmacological treatments. So to convey a sense of what OCD is like for individuals who suffer, I'd like to try a thought experiment with you, which will involve your participation in a poll that will appear on your screen shortly. So first, I'd like everybody to take a look at the picture and then close their eyes. So imagine you have been on a hike all day, and you realize you forgot your water bottle and you're parched. You're desperately thirsty, but the only water lies in a toilet bowl. Would you drink it? So we're going to now put a survey up on the screen, and I'd like everybody to take a moment and cast your vote in one of 3 ways. One is, yes, I would drink immediately. The second would be, yes, I would, but I would pause by weighing the pros and cons. And C is no, no way. So give people a few minutes to log in and vote one of those 3 options, and then we'll have the results posted up. I'm very curious now. Haha. Okay, 10% yes, I would drink immediately. 63% in that middle group, yes, but pause after weighing pros and cons. And 20% like me, no way. Great. Okay, so let's get back to the slides. Okay, so the results show that we have a mix. Again, some people would drink right away, others would pause, and others would say no. For that larger middle group, take a moment to think about what thoughts were popping into your mind that made you pause. So were they thoughts about getting sick from the water, contamination, germs? So for people with OCD with contamination fears, an ordinary water fountain can look like a toilet bowl. And this is a picture of an exhibit called Sip of Conflict found at the Exploratorium here in San Francisco. This is an exhibit in which in the main hall there's 2 fountains that are juxtaposed. One is a regular water fountain and the other is a water fountain made of an unused toilet bowl. And in real time, if you'd like to come to San Francisco to see this exhibit, you can see one of these 3 reactions actually. You see people either approaching it, maybe snickering a little bit, but eventually drinking, some who are kind of in the middle debating what to do, and those who are actually maybe peeled, have to peel them off the wall like me. So, with that in mind, imagine that pause that you took, if you had one, and imagine now somebody with OCD that has this experience, this pause and trying to weigh and trying to think about their behaviors when confronted with all of the ordinary objects that they would need to get their day started. And all of these micro moments, this questioning, is the door locked, is the stove off, should I touch the coffee cup, all of these things. You can see very quickly how it would be impairing and distressing if you had this moment all throughout your day. So my research goal lies in understanding the biology of OCD and how we can use that understanding to improve treatments. Psychiatry disorders are increasingly understood as a consequence of brain circuits gone awry. In OCD, converging lines of evidence suggest hyperactivity in the circuits between the frontal regions, so these areas in green, and deeper structures contribute to OCD. What's highlighted here are some loops that include the cortex, the striatum, and thalamus, looping back to the cortex again. And this abnormal activity may be a result in part due to problems in the balance of chemical messengers in the brain, which include serotonin, glutamate, and GABA. And these chemical messengers send signals through receptors or docking ports located in the building blocks for circuit cells called neurons. And they can convey either, the next one, Receptors can convey a excitatory message like glutamate, or they may convey an inhibitory message with the chemical messenger called GABA. And circuits make up or circuits comprise these neural networks, and the composition of neural networks and how they fire in synchrony and the symphony of this activity is in turn what generates and results in behaviors that we can see. Now, I became very interested in glutamate because there was, at the time in the field, the hypothesis that glutamate played a role in OCD. And I was very curious about work that had been done showing that medication that altered levels of glutamate decreased symptoms in OCD, as well as a line of evidence from an animal model of OCD called the SAPAP3 that has these repetitive grooming behaviors, and evidence that it also affected this pathway. At the same time, ketamine was showing these really remarkable effects in depression, bipolar, and since ketamine is a drug that acts on glutamate, we wanted to test it for the first time. So ketamine is a type of glutamate receptor antagonist. At high doses, it's used FDA-approved drug for anesthesia in adults and children. And at lower doses is where it was having these effects in depression. We tested it for the first time in a single case of OCD and found remarkable effects. And we followed it up with a randomized controlled crossover study to look at, and we found actually that ketamine decreases OCD symptoms. And this is a chart of the study's design. So 31 individuals were assessed for eligibility and 15 were enrolled. All individuals got 2 infusions, one of ketamine and one of placebo or saline. But the order of the infusions was randomized and different in Arm A and Arm B. And the reason why we do the design studies this way is because then you can combine the results of both of the phases and to give you more power. That's assuming that there isn't a carryover effect, assuming that ketamine doesn't continue to have effects in the second phase. But we found that indeed, and science will surprise you, this is a wonderful thing, that there was a carryover effect. And so what I'll be presenting now is only the comparison of phase 1 of 8 individuals that received ketamine and 7 with placebo. And what we found is when we asked individuals to rate their symptoms levels of their obsessions on the scale on the left-hand side, 10 being constant intrusive obsessions and 0 being none, we asked over time, how did this change both before, during, and after the infusion of ketamine? All patients were given a single infusion. It was 40 minutes infusion of 0.5 milligrams per kilogram of ketamine or saline. What you see is by halfway through the 40-minute infusion, there was already a significant separation of effect, which was wonderful to see. And to me, even more interesting was that even after the drug was metabolized in the body, you continued to see these effects and persisting out to 1 week. In addition, individuals who participated in the study were not on any other medications. And so this was the first time to show that a drug that acted on the glutamate system as opposed to the serotonin system could be helpful in reducing rapidly symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder. So what was this experience like for individuals 1 week out? Using a scale that we use to measure those that have clinically meaningful effects, using the Yale-Brown Obsessive-Compulsive Scale. Well, half of the individuals met criteria for having this clinically meaningful change, as opposed to 0 that had saline. What was it like for individuals? So here's some quotes for responders after ketamine. Some said, I feel like the weight of OCD has been lifted. I want to feel this way forever. Others said, I tried to have OCD thoughts and I couldn't. And this was quite remarkable to hear and to observe. The side effects included feelings of unreality and dissociation. Everyone had this experience. Some individuals had dizziness, one had nausea, one vomited, one individual had headache. The blood pressure changes were consistent with those seen in the other studies of depression, consistent with what we would expect with ketamine. So in summary, this is the first study to show that ketamine can decrease intrusive thoughts in the absence of a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, and that glutamate modulation may be a rapid-acting therapeutic target for OCD. Now, as I showed you in terms of the side effects, this is a challenge. Ketamine has side effects, and as a clinician and a researcher, we want to design interventions that don't have these side effects. So I'll talk to you next about some work that I did with a compound. Again, it was originally called GLIX13. It was invented by Dr. Joe Mascal. It is a monoclonal antibody-derived neuropeptide and thought to be a glutamate modulator, so thought to work in the same pathway. Since it's been purchased and called rapastinel now. So could rapastinel be an OCD therapeutic? That's a question that we wanted to know. And the reason that motivated that was it shows rapid antidepressant activity without ketamine-like effects in animal models. And at the time when I heard about the compound, it was in a phase A randomized multi-dose controlled study showing that 10 mg per kg had a significant antidepressant effects versus placebo. At higher doses, it lost its effect. So we decided to test the effects of rapastinel at this dose, 10 milligrams per kilogram. It was open label, meaning everybody got rapastinel. And we included individuals that had at least moderate OCD severity, again, that were unmedicated, and excluded individuals that had severe depression or the other things listed here. And what we found was quite interesting. So in the 7 people with OCD that participated in this study, each was given a single dose of rapastinel, and you see that in this kind of light gray bar. And we found that that the effects of rapastinel, it decreased patients' symptoms over time. It decreased obsessions and compulsions, as well as symptoms of anxiety and depression. We also found that the drug was well tolerated. No patient reported dissociative or floating feeling side effects. And we were quite surprised that within hours of treatment, we saw these decrease in effects. Now, while the effects on OCD symptoms were rapid, they were not long-lasting. So when we evaluated for the Yale-Brown Obsessive-Compulsive Scale 1 week after treatment, the symptoms were about as severe as they had been prior to treatment. When we looked at and that was the case also for the depression as well. But for the anxiety, there was a significant difference that persisted up to 1 week. So in summary, rapastinel is well tolerated in unmedicated OCD patients as it is in those with depression. It did not increase the dissociative effects or other side effects, unlike ketamine. There were acute effects within hours in OCD, anxiety, and depression, but no effects with OCD 1 week post-infusion. And so the next steps will be testing the effects of repeated dosing and working to develop related drugs that reduce OCD symptoms over a sustained period. And the work in my lab is focused on continuing to develop next generation medications for individuals with OCD that work rapidly. And we're funded by the National Institutes of Health to try and understand the mechanisms of ketamine, using ketamine as a probe to try and understand how it affects and at what level it affects brain structures related to OCD, so that we can use that as a template to be able to test novel medications. And also looking at biomarkers of ketamine's effects, funded by the Harold Amos Robert Wood Johnson. So I'd like to take a moment to thank all of my collaborators for the study, and also thank the members of my lab here at Stanford. And ultimately what we want is to have an impact in OCD. We want to demonstrate both that rapidly acting treatments are possible, to shed light on the severity of OCD, and decrease stigma. This is our lab. We did the 1 Million Steps for OCD walk last year in Oakland and this year in Sacramento. And we encourage you, if you have any questions about the work that I've discussed here, you're interested in study participation, we're here at Stanford, but within the greater area around Stanford and San Francisco, we encourage you to reach out to us at ocdresearch@stanford.edu. And I'll stop there.
Carolyn, thank you very much, really, for an excellent presentation that I think is readily understandable by lay people as well as by scientists. And thank you for the work that you're doing. We have a number of questions about the use of rapastinel. One is, what concerns do you have about repeated use or long-term use of this particular medicine? What do you see as obstacles to that?
Great question, Jeff. So I don't think we know enough about it to be able to predict long-term consequences. I can just speak from my experience with ketamine. The fact that I have those concerns with ketamine in terms of, again, we don't have long-term studies, but the fact that people are having also these sort of visible side effects of dissociation. That was something very heartening for me with rapastinel, that I didn't see any of this. There was no adverse events. In fact, it was remarkably well tolerated. And again, as a clinician, that's something that I feel could have great promise.
And do you have a sense of a time frame where this might be available as a mode of treatment for people?
Yes, it's a couple years out, in terms of, right now it's in phase 3 studies. Then it needs to get approval for FDA. But definitely, it's on the horizon, and to me that's something that's quite exciting.
Yeah, very much so. And this can only be given by IV? There isn't a version that would be a pill form?
Mm-hmm. It's an IV formulation, and I think follow-on compounds are in development in terms of pill version, but this compound, that the way we used it, was an IV formulation.
And if it were to be approved and used in clinical practice in this formulation, do you have a sense of how frequently it would be used? Like, what would it be like to use this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Exactly. So I think that's where the work needs to come in, to try and understand what is the length of effect, what's the type of dosing. Those are open questions, and things that I'm definitely curious about.
So this is part of your research at this point, and sort of the next stage of your research is to look at how long it lasts, how frequently you have to give it on an ongoing basis to have that continued therapeutic effect. Would there be additional side effects if the person takes it more frequently?
Right, and I think right now that the drug is moving toward indication for major depression. So when that's approved, until it gets FDA approval for OCD, it would have to be prescribed off-label. But it will have a specific indication and a dosing schedule for depression. And if it's any indication, looking at how SSRIs work in depression and OCD, for OCD, typically use similar SRI medications, but they need to be administered at higher doses and for longer periods of time. So it may be that further work is needed to explore how it is maximized in OCD. And also, I just want to go back to be more specific about your question in terms of the approval for rapastinel. I think if all goes well, they would be able to file in mid-2020 and get approval in 2021. So again, it's on the horizon.
All right, so it's not that far off, and that would be for the depression indication.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And based upon the work with ketamine and depression and then ketamine and OCD, the dosage for ketamine and OCD, is that a similar type of dosage as
yes,
used in depression?
Exactly. So we've used 0.5 mg per kg, and that's the studies that have been used in depression. I think a recent dose-finding study also recommended 0.5 mg per kg as a good dose. So that's true. So maybe that in the glutamate pathway potentially could be similar dosing. But again, we just need to be able to do the work to be able to know in a randomized study, in a controlled study.
Right. Okay. In terms of current trials going on using the rapastinel, how would people find out if there's studies that they could potentially be a part of for this?
Mm-hmm. There's postings for clinical research trials at clinicaltrials.gov, and that's an excellent source. If you put that into a search engine and then you can type in OCD, you can type in location, it can give you a sense of what clinical studies or clinical trials are going in the area. You can also put in a search by the study drug that you're interested in. So it's a wonderful resource. And actually, I'm, just want to say that I'm incredibly grateful for folks that are willing to participate in research studies. I believe that folks that do this are really unsung heroes because they are sacrificing and giving of their time in terms of advancing the science, not necessarily for their own gain, but for that of the field. And it's a really incredible gift that somebody is giving when they participate in research study.
I agree with you. And it is always wonderful to see how people do want to help other people, not necessarily themselves, but other people. Although in these instances, given the time frame, this research can help people soon once these results come in. Can you speak a little bit about other current treatments for OCD, for instance, talk therapy, CBT, etc. Talk a little bit about what that entails, how that works, what the findings have been with regards to that for people with OCD.
Definitely. Happy to. So the two first-line treatments, the pharmacological treatments, are serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That's where I focus my thoughts. But the other first-line treatment is cognitive behavioral therapy with exposure and response prevention. And there's a very consistent, very robust body of literature showing this can be extremely helpful for patients and is something definitely to be considered for individuals who are coming for help for the first time for OCD, and also for folks who are on an SSRI who it's not working for them. The addition of exposure and response prevention can be very beneficial for individuals. There's a wonderful paper by Simpson et al. That shows that the addition of this can be quite helpful for people who continue to have symptoms. So I think it's a wonderful tool in our armamentarium. One of the difficulties on the medication front is that it has side effects, and for the type of therapy, the cognitive behavioral therapy with exposure and response prevention, one of the advantages of it doesn't have drug-related side effects. So for anybody who's very sensitive to medications, this is a wonderful alternative. On the flip side, people may be reluctant to engage in cognitive behavioral therapy, and partly due to the fact of that the treatment involves talking about, thinking about, and acting to disentangle the obsessions from the compulsions. So it involves thinking about the fearful thoughts in a hierarchy, and thinking about, what is making you from least anxious to most anxious, and then progressively going through and exposing in a systematic way to those thoughts that raise anxiety, and showing the individual that you don't necessarily have to do the compulsion to decrease anxiety. So the connection between those two things becomes weaker and weaker over time. And individuals learn that as anxiety increases, it naturally goes down. But as you can imagine, it's quite hard to do that. If on the hierarchy, the top is, if you have contamination fears, going to Grand Central Station and touching the bathroom, that in and of itself might have people not want to participate in it. But, we urge people to try as much as possible, because, the therapist will work with you. It's tailored. You wouldn't necessarily jump to you wouldn't jump to the top of the hierarchy. You would start, a guided approach with the therapist to start at your first level. And I like to share with people that For me, it's the closest analogy is learning to swim as an adult swimmer. I was just terrified of going into the water, and it isn't something that I could read a self-help book or do by myself. I actually really needed a coach who had experience getting people to swim and taking it slowly by slowly. So when my swim instructor saw me on the wall, she advised me to sit down and put my toe in the water. Once I got used to that, then the next day, go into your knees, go into your waist, etc. So it's something that, that if explained, if the model of it is explained in a lucid way, and you can get the cooperation of somebody to actually engage in it, can be really a fantastic treatment.
I think that's a very good analogy, and thank you for sharing your personal experience. How's your swimming at this point in time?
I can swim. Yes, it's terrific. Okay. I think for me the greatest fear was submerging my head under the water right. and feeling like I was swimming. And but little by little, it was so helpful.
And I think the same works clinically for OCD. You spoke about the age of onset of symptoms. When people begin to experience these symptoms and if family members see it and are concerned, what should the family do to be helpful?
Mm-hmm. So I think getting a second opinion is always helpful. When in terms of, I think if I can kind of summarize your question, you're thinking about from very early age or more adolescence. What?
I'll start with, because I think there's a few things, but I'll start with what you're saying now. Let's say somebody views their teenage child as maybe right. having some of these symptoms, some of the anxiety, some of the behaviors. Mm-hmm. What's the best approach for those parents to help their child?
Perfect. Yes. So I think going to a mental health professional to get a second opinion is always helpful. It has to be a good fit in terms of. Always encourage people to get an opinion and then get a second opinion. Because it's helpful to have, multiple points of view on a particular symptom. And It's been my occasional experience that individuals with OCD can be diagnosed with other types of mental illness, and that isn't helpful in terms of a medication perspective. So the thoughts, if you're having an intrusive thought that you are, if you don't align your pen a certain way, that your mother will die, that sounds like a thought that would be within the psychosis realm, but it is not. It is totally within the spectrum of obsessive-compulsive disorder. So you need somebody who has a level of expertise in terms of feeling comfortable with these types of symptoms. As well, in the adolescent stage, but really all throughout adulthood, it can be embarrassing to talk to somebody who they don't know about these things. So it's important to find a provider that makes people feel at ease and isn't going to be surprised by these thoughts, and in fact is encouraging and eliciting. Hey, do you ever have thoughts, intrusive thoughts of harming others, or that you've run something over? So to really have the provider kind of volunteer some of those thoughts to make people feel comfortable and more willing to share.
All very, very good advice. And what should people do if they have had treatment and the treatment really isn't helping them? What's the next step? They've taken a serotonergic reuptake inhibitor, maybe they've had some CBT, it's not working. What do you do?
Exactly. So, I just want to say that there's a wonderful resource that steps through the practice guidelines for treatment of patients with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and it's available free online. It's a supplement to the American Journal of Psychiatry. The lead author is Larry Curran, 2007, and there was an updated version in 2013 by Curran and Simpson. And in it, it spells out a lovely guideline for the treatment of OCD. And so, exactly right. So if the first line treatments of cognitive behavioral therapy with exposure and response prevention, or SRIs, don't work, what's next? And within that algorithm, it's important to assess whether the response is adequate after 8 to 12 total weeks of SRI, with at least 4 to 6 weeks at the maximal tolerated dose, or 13 to 20 weekly sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy over the course of 3 weeks. So it's important, again, to get the adequate dose to determine whether there's response or not. Oftentimes people can be taking a medication that's approved for OCD, but at a lower dose than for OCD. So that's always an important piece to double check. Now, if there's a response to it, then the medication can continue for 1 to 2 years, and then you can consider a gradual taper. For cognitive behavioral therapy, if you're getting a good response, then the recommendation is to do booster sessions for 3 to 6 months. But the question that you asked is, what happens if this isn't working? What are the strategies for augmentation, for adding things that can be helpful? And one of the strategies for people that are having a moderate response is to augment with cognitive behavioral therapy if that has not already been provided. Again, as I mentioned before, there's wonderful data showing this can be extremely helpful. The other strategy is augmentation with a second-generation antipsychotic. The study that was recently published by Simpson et al. Showed that the addition of cognitive behavioral therapy was more efficacious in that study than augmentation with risperidone. They compared the risperidone with placebo and found that those were acted about the same, and cognitive behavioral therapy was significantly higher than both of those. The strategies for a little or no response are to switch to a different SSRI, so you can try more than one trial. If that doesn't work, the other possibility is to switch to clomipramine. And again, within this, it's possible also to then add a second-generation antipsychotic. One thing to note is that antipsychotics have metabolic side effects, and when used clinically, I will see if they've had a dramatic effect and really go through the pros and cons of adding an antipsychotic, because it can have risks of weight gain, tardive dyskinesia, which is like a tic-based facial a tic that basically stays. Also neuroleptic malignant syndrome, which can cause high fever. So an antipsychotic medication is not something to be taken lightly, and not something that I would recommend people continue to be on if they're not receiving benefit on it. As well, one can try switching to venlafaxine or mirtazapine.
Is there any benefit to using benzodiazepine, like Ativan, Xanax, etc., Klonopin, at least at the onset of treatment, to help with some of the anxiety when treatment is beginning?
Yeah, I think it isn't as you're pointing out that it isn't really a first-line treatment, but potentially something that can help with anxiety management. As the treatments are coming on board. And I think that's one of the things as clinicians that we find very frustrating. It takes SSRIs on the order of 2 to 3 months to have benefits, and also cognitive behavioral therapy. And meantime, individuals are in a lot of pain. One study that we did was testing whether a single dose of ketamine given prior to a very focused dose of cognitive behavioral therapy could have synergistic effects. And the idea sort of from the clinical side is that giving ketamine and having this reduction in symptoms and the sort of painful part of OCD could help while the exposure and response preventing was kicking in. But also a sort of more biological rationale is that ketamine is thought to increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This is a molecule that helps learning and memory and plasticity of the cells of the neurons. And so the idea was, could we give the cognitive behavioral therapy in the same window as the animal model showed that these effects were active, so within 2 weeks. And what we found was that after the dose of ketamine and then 2 weeks or 10 one-hour sessions of exposure and response prevention. And when we tracked people out to 2 weeks, we found 60% responders. So there was a bit of a synergistic effect.
Okay, that's very interesting. And obviously, an important message is people shouldn't give up. That if something doesn't work, there's always the opportunity for other options, either in the here and now, what we have in our current list of approaches, and down the road as new approaches are developed.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and I would also add to that being part of a support group can be very helpful as well. We've reached out in the area to local OCD support groups, and they really do a wonderful job educating, talking about new treatments on the horizon, things that work, things that maybe individuals hadn't thought of before, that can be very helpful. So one of the things that I also wanted to say is that there's the International OCD Foundation, which sponsors an annual conference. And this year there's an annual conference that's going to be here in San Francisco. It's July 7th through 9th. And what's really special, I think, about this conference is that includes researchers, individuals suffering from OCD, their families, first responders, healthcare providers. So anybody who is touched by OCD is welcome to come to this conference. And they have different tracks for everybody, tracks for individuals with OCD, bilingual tracks, parents and families, therapists, and then a track for research to clinical practice. And so if you are interested in finding out more and getting connected to a community of folks who are interested or potentially have OCD, this would be a conference that I would highly recommend.
Good. Thank you for sharing that information. I want to go back a little bit to your discussion about ketamine and rapastinel and the side effects. What do you attribute the difference, in particular the key side effect of dissociation, between the ketamine and the rapastinel? Why is there such a why does that not occur in the newer medication?
Mm-hmm. On first blush, I think it's due to the mechanism of how the drug interacts with the receptors in the brain. Ketamine interacts with 19 different contact sites, these docking ports or receptors within the brain. We don't yet know which of these is responsible for the dissociative side effects, but on initial thought, rapastinel may not be acting through that pathway.
Okay, so it's a different, so that it may have some of the therapeutic effects, but not the side effects, because its approach, its pathways are different, and therefore doesn't include that, but does include the therapeutic.
Exactly, and there was a lovely, very elegant work by Todd Gould and his colleagues with Carlos Zarate, showing that in an animal model there's a metabolite of ketamine called hydroxynorketamine that seems to have, again, the same rapid-acting properties in depression, but may not have the dissociative side effects. And so, I think there's a lot of exciting research coming out and ways in which we may be able to work around the side effects or find compounds or other drugs that target the same glutamate pathway but won't have these side effects. And in the end, that's really what we're excited for patients.
Right. And the hydroxynorketamine, has that been looked at in terms of OCD?
It has not been looked at. I'd love to do that, but I know that hydroxynorketamine is now being studied in a human model of depression in the clinical trial.
Right.
And
so a next step with that might be to look at it
exactly.
in an OCD trial to see if that is effective without the side effects.
Exactly.
The looking at the field as a researcher, as a person who is a young researcher, what do you see as the challenges in the broadest of sense for people who are going into research, challenges and the opportunities for a young researcher such as yourself?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly one of the challenges is funding, and I think that is the key thing that just makes NARSAD and BBRF a really, really special organization. The very first grant that I got was a NARSAD Young Investigator Award when I was in training. They took a chance on a rookie, so to speak, and I think that's a really special thing about NARSAD. Really looking at scientific proposals and being willing to take a chance on novel and exciting ideas where somebody is proposing something new, doesn't have pilot data yet but has a promising idea. And one of the wonderful things about NARSAD is that it spurs that creativity and that pilot data, which then can be grown exponentially to be able to get funding. So that pilot project that I did ended up being part of a NIH-funded training grant, and that ended up producing data that I presented here, which ended up then being part of an NIH-funded R01. So you can see how the seed is planted with NARSAD. It can really grow for researchers, and so it's something I'm really grateful for. So go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, as a new trainee, I think you just need somebody to kind of give you a break, right? You may have ideas.
That's a very good point. Yeah, it's a very good point, and I think it's a statement of the generosity of our donors who support research, and the expertise and generosity of our all-volunteer scientific council, who, based upon their knowledge, are able to take a risk and give a chance to a new rookie, and in this case, a rookie who has gone on to the All-Star team, and it really makes a very, very big difference for people. I appreciate you sharing that experience. When you look to the future, whether it be for OCD, for depression, other anxiety disorders, where do you see us going? What do you see as being the future of treatment in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and for people to look forward to?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have tremendous hope. I have to say that after doing many clinical trials that had negative outcomes, seeing the results with ketamine and seeing a patient's eyes light up and for the first time saying, okay, this is what it's like to not have OCD, is just such a joyful moment as a clinician and a researcher. To provide that relief makes me a believer that we're embarking on a whole new pathway of drugs and compounds that can make a big difference in people's lives. Now, I don't think ketamine is ready for prime time for the reasons that I mentioned in terms of side effects and trying to figure out dosing of these different things, but I feel tremendous hope that we're narrowing down and trying to get in partnership with animal researchers and clinical researchers, and different modalities in terms of the excitement of neuroimaging capabilities, both functional at the molecular level, that we're really working together as a community to identify these new treatments. And at the end of the day, to me, that's what that drives me and provides me an excitement to come into work every day to work on these problems. In addition, I think something that is going to be very critical for the field is incorporating also the leaps in technological advances that we have in terms of computation, advances across big data sets, thinking about issues of personalization, as well as trying to think and design ways to capture OCD symptoms that aren't solely based on a self-report. Anybody who has a family member that has OCD can see symptoms change, sometimes even before the individual does. Oh, I see that they're not washing so much. Oh, they must be getting better. So how to capture that to make clinical trials more robust is another avenue that we're pursuing.
I think all very important. I want to ask about something that you spoke about that's crucial. You brought it up at the beginning, which is the significant number of people who have OCD that attempt suicide. And I'd like to speak a little bit about the suicide risk and what could be done to help mitigate that risk.
Such an important issue. It speaks to the fact that individuals with OCD, I see them suffering in silence. Oftentimes they're highly functional in terms of a work environment externally, but internally they're spending hours and hours, teachers spending hours and hours organizing and rearranging the kids' things before she can get home to spend time with her kids. Somebody in the legal profession spending hours and hours, making sure that everything has, no spelling errors, no punctuation, which is adaptive, yes, but when it turns to a point of excessiveness, can be very challenging. The doctor who spends hours with notations and just doesn't have a life because of it. And I think the way I think of OCD is that the individual essentially is in a prison of the mind that we can't see. They're prisoner and locked and held hostage by these thoughts that they can't control. And it's a terrible way to be, and my heart reaches out to folks because unlike other illnesses, which are more visually apparent, folks really are keeping all of this inside, and I think that really compounds the the suffering and the isolation which can lead somebody to suicide. Now, there's been very little research on this, and we're just publishing a report from the ICOX group looking at suicide attempts, where this statistic comes from. And, just to highlight the severity of it, and that we need more research in terms of, what puts people at risk. How do we mitigate these risks? Is it the same as other disorders? Does having OCD put you at more risk for suicidality compared to others? These are unanswered questions and important for the field.
Yeah, very important. I'm going to ask a question that someone posed that is a very moving question. I think speaks to a lot of family members, and I'm going to read it verbatim. I'm not saying the name of the person. It's so difficult to see my son struggling with OCD. It feels very helpless. And what do you say to a parent who is experiencing this?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I'm sorry, is where I would say. I think I've seen families be torn apart by OCD, and the first thing I do is just really commend that family member for sticking with their loved one and supporting them, and it's incredibly heartbreaking to be the family member and to see and feel helpless in that way. What I would say is that it's very important for the family member to also think about themselves and getting support for themselves. I've seen, again, in the local area here that I've been, the groups that OCD support groups that I've been a part of have been for patients, and also there have been ones that are specific for family members. And so being able to kind of reach out and feel like there's a community of folks that feel similarly is something that can be very sustaining.
I think that's very important advice for OCD and for other conditions, that the family who cares so much about their loved one and feels the stress of wanting to help them, and often successful, sometimes not, should get help for themselves as well and support for themselves as well. Very important and good advice. Carolyn, I want to thank you, first of all, for taking the time to put this presentation together and to speak with us. But more importantly, for the work that you've done, continue to do, to help people, to find better treatments. I find it inspiring, and I find it as something that gives tremendous hope for the future. And I just want to say thank you very, very much for all that you're doing.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate your work, and I'm just eternally grateful to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation for their support.
Good. Well, thank you, and we're grateful for the work that you're doing. I also want to thank everybody who's joined us today. All of the research that we fund is made possible through private donations, and if you'd like to make a contribution, please visit bbrfoundation.org or call 800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you'd missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it with a family member or friend, please visit the events page on our website, and it'll provide you with a lead to the webinar. Also, please visit our website for future webinar programming information. Thank you all again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.